Hello everyone, good to see you again. I wanted to talk about James Rachel's article on euthanasia. And Rachel's was the head of the philosophy department at the University of Alabama and died of cancer in 2002. He was that rarest of philosophers writing best-selling books, like his little book called The Elements of Ethics. And I think I know why he achieved such status as a best-selling author. And that is that he writes very clearly and he argues cogently. I think that he's combined clear thinking with clear writing and became very popular for that reason. And he just has doesn't get overly academic about the subjects, but just reasons well enough. Now, the article that you read is on euthanasia, and there's a case of Jack with his tumor. And Rachel poses the question, is it best that Jack be allowed to die? And many of you wrote in response, yeah, if he wants to. And now I thought we would talk about some of the terminology used here. A definition of euthanasia, well, first it's a Greek word, so you in front of a word like in eugenics or euphony, which means good sound, EU means good. Thanatos, the Greek root, means death. And so the Greeks thought it to mean a good death. They were for it. They were against monstrous births. People could not be saved by the state of medical knowledge in 4th century BC. We still can't save people who are anencephalic, who die with who are born with a partial brain or no brain at all. Like this, they called monstrous births. They'd allow the person to die, not being able to save them. So the Greeks, whether it's Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, are not just concerned with living, but living well. It's a life of well-being that they prize, not mere existence. And so it's not surprising that they would argue for, they would allow, be in favor of euthanasia. So that's a definition. Well, these days, without the etymology of you and thanatos together, we can just look at the word meaning, it's a synonym for mercy killing. And that already colors it and says that it's killing someone, but for a motive of pity or mercy because of the parlous state that they're in, this terrible condition, suffering, and perhaps in cases like you have in Oregon, it's terminal illness. Terminal illness being defined as 6 months or less to live, and you've had 2 doctors who say that this, let's say, metastasized cancer. You have 6 months or less to live, and therefore you can avail yourself of the law, the Death with Dignity Act that exists in Oregon, to take this medicine that will take your life in just a matter of minutes. I'll send you a link on that, how that works there. I said one link is about 3 minutes long, the other one's 14 by the New York Times. The New York Times retro report on the right to die. It's consistently good work that they do in these reports. So the second thing, active versus passive euthanasia. Some of you know what this is already, I'm sure. Think of active euthanasia as taking an active measure, or it's hastening death by injecting someone with a drug that will kill them, or as in Oregon, taking the medicines that will kill you in seconds later. Active euthanasia, in the cases where Dr. Kevorkian from the 1990s, the retired pathologist who lived in Michigan, pathologists deal with tissue. Kevorkian obliged some 130 patients who contacted him, people who had no real future quality to their lives, who were in terrible pain and were going to die soon anyway, so those 3 qualities. And he thought it was his job to relieve their suffering. He thought that the medical community in general was not doing this, and so he could do it. And he came up with a 3-part injection. One would put you to sleep, and the second would stop your breathing, and the third would stop your heart. Similar to the 3-part injection that was used on death row, which takes just a matter of minutes. So that's one form of active euthanasia, the injection. The other is the monoxide mask that he later used, and the other is the pills that you take in Oregon, Washington, and 7 other states, in the District of Columbia, so it's legal in 9 states. But so that's active euthanasia, and Rachel's is for that, pretty much because he has utilitarian leanings. If you take someone's life quickly, as opposed to slowly, you reduce their pain states. And as a utilitarian, remember, you want to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, or minimize displeasure, and maximize pleasure, which is the same thing as happiness, and that's the idea. Passive euthanasia, you would either do, seems two things: not put someone on a life support machinery in the first place, not to put someone on a respirator, let's say, to prolong their life, or once they're on it, to take them off the machinery. So someone might be found to be brain dead, and the family says, okay, there's no sense keeping this person alive artificially, let's turn off the machinery. That's considered to be passive euthanasia, and that has never been against the law. That has been, the medical community has smiled on that kind of activity. But the thing about Rachel's, and an article he wrote in 1975 in the New England Journal of Medicine, he wrote a 5-page article that's, in my mind, masterful, and is often reprinted in ethics textbooks. And there he took on the medical community, which in their policy statement from 1975 had said, we approve of passive euthanasia, or that is to say, doing nothing and letting the patient die. This gets into letting die versus killing, you see. So he's for that, but they were for that, the doctors in their statement. But they're against the hastening of death, or active euthanasia. And Rachel's turns the whole thing on its head in that particular article, saying that their position is the morally corrupt one. The better one is to be for active euthanasia, since it eliminates pain, it allows the patient to die quickly, as opposed to a slow, agonizing death. And that's, as you see with Jack in the cancer ward in Bethesda, Maryland, in the hospital. Jack, who has the tumor, was visited by his wife. In that case, he sets up at the beginning. So if Jack wants to die, then Rachel's would say the more moral thing to do, if you imagine that he said, I want to die, the more moral thing to do would be to hasten his death and have him put to death with an injection or medicine of some kind, which didn't exist at the time of the writing of that article. That was not the law. The law did not become law in Oregon until 1994. And then the next state, Washington State, wasn't until 2008 election day, as it turned out, that prevented. So these are relatively new measures that allow for this. But there he argues for that the active euthanasia is superior morally to the passive. Now, the other distinctions we want to make that are not so clear in the article, kind of hinted at: voluntary, non-voluntary, and involuntary euthanasia. First, the voluntary euthanasia, which is the thing he's talking about, the kind of case he's talking about throughout the article. Voluntary, it's a word that goes back to Aristotle, that you will something, you want to do something. So it's a voluntary action, it's a free action. So the patient here has made clear that they want to die. Perhaps they have a written will that says this, where they have a health care proxy, which doesn't even require the signature of a lawyer, saying that I, so-and-so, John Smith, don't want extraordinary measures to keep myself alive, and that is to say, I don't want to be hooked up to machinery and allow me to die. That would be a case of voluntary euthanasia. Involuntary, obviously the opposite of voluntary. If it's involuntary euthanasia, you're putting someone to death against their will. They want to, some of you wrote, perhaps they want to suffer, they want to put up with the suffering of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or the metastasized cancer, or the full-blown AIDS, whatever the case may be. They want to see it through, and they're willing to suffer the pain for some other, something they may get out of it, seeing family members more, or something of that sort. But despite their wanting to go on, you kill them anyway, or you do something to remove life support, or you do something to hasten their death. So involuntary goes against their wishes, and most people think of that as murder. It's killing someone against their will. Seems like a pretty close to a definition of what murder is, killing someone with malice aforethought. They want to live. Now the voluntary, the non-voluntary one, my last one here, if you can see it, non-voluntary euthanasia, usually non-voluntary. Those are the sticky cases. The third kind of, if you can see it there, after I have voluntary and involuntary euthanasia, is non-voluntary euthanasia. This is when we don't know the will of the patient. And so perhaps they've fallen into a coma, and therefore guardians decide for them what should be done. There are three famous right-to-die cases in the United States. I mean, there are many other less renowned cases. But the one starts in 1975 with Karen Ann Quinlan, a resident of New Jersey, a young woman of 21 years old who mixed alcohol and drugs at a party and then went home, wasn't feeling so well. Her roommates checked in on her and found that she was comatose and unresponsive. I guess they couldn't declare her comatose, but unresponsive. And so they called the ambulance, and it turns out she never regained consciousness. And long story short, she was in this state for 11 years, 1975 to 1986. When she died, it had become such a celebrated case that was on the front page of the New York Times. I can still remember it. But she was shipped off to St. Clair's Hospital in Denville, which has a superior neurological facility there. But in effect, she never regained consciousness. So Joseph Quinlan, her father, became the guardian under the law. Now this is the case. He makes decisions for her. It's non-voluntary. She couldn't decide for herself. How many 21-year-olds have living wills in advance? The second such case was the case of Nancy Cruzan, a woman of 27 years old, driving along a dark road at night and hits an icy patch and is thrown from her car some distance and lands face down in a ditch. And then she, like Quinlan, has a state, it's called anoxia, lack of oxygen to the brain. If you don't get oxygen to the brain, then the brain essentially can liquefy. If you don't get oxygen to the brain for just a few minutes, permanent brain damage can result. This was at least a half an hour before medical units showed up. So Cruzan, from the time of 1983 to 1990, 7 years she's in this condition where her sister becomes the guardian, making decisions for her. This was not over a respirator. The battle in the course was not over a respirator as it was with Quinlan, but it was food and water. Should we remove the feeding tubes? And this is ultimately they were allowed to. The family prevailed and was able to get the life support removed. Finally, the case of Terry Schiavo, a woman from Florida, 29 years old, who in 1990 was always dieting, and the dieting drugs that she was taking caused her to have a potassium shortage. The potassium shortage caused her heart to stop, and if the heart stops for a period of time, you're not getting oxygen to the brain, of course, and so she too, it's anoxia. These three cases are united by that condition, and she did not have whole brain death. Neither of the three did. Partial brain death, so the lower stem functioning of the brain ceased to be. The higher activity of the brain, cognition, recognition of people around her, consciousness seemed to be lost. But again, decisions had to be made for her, in this case the husband. Michael Schiavo, decided that she would not want it to be kept alive this way. But what threw a hurdle in his way was that Terry Schiavo's mother and father battled him in the courts and said that she should not, since she didn't have a living will, again, it's non-voluntary, it's not so clear that she would not want to continue. And so she stays in a comatose state, downgraded to PVS, or persistent vegetative state. After 15 years, she dies in the spring of 2005 after they remove her life support. But she dies not actively as a result of removing it. She takes a couple of weeks to die, as it turns out. Probably not conscious, thankfully, so she wasn't aware of her fading away while not being given food and water. So in these kinds of cases, this is it shows that the non-voluntary variety is a hard thing to, it's the hardest one to decide, because if you don't have the will of the patient in speech or in writing, then you have to decide for them. I mean, the law is set up to handle these kinds of cases. It's set up wonderfully, really, but there can be battles among family members and so on too. So I think in all three of those cases, if there had been a law, Quinlan 1975, Cruzan 1983, and Schiavo 1990, someone like Rachel's would have said the best thing to do is not to have any removal of life support, slow death, rather hasten death. This is what he's for, active euthanasia. So I thought I'd help clarify that, and I'll talk to you again soon.